No more dates. The most shocking truth hitting society right now is that nearly half of women aged 20 to 45 are on track to end up single and childless, not decades from now, but accelerating much faster than anyone predicted, because men have quietly but decisively stepped away from the dating game entirely. Picture this: women who once dismissed men as unnecessary or toxic are now facing a stark reality where no one approaches them. No one asks them out, and no one offers to share the burdens of life, leaving them to confront inflation, loneliness, and the harsh edges of independence alone. This is not a temporary trend or a phase. It is a fundamental shift where men have chosen peace over pursuit, self respect over sacrifice, and solitude over superficial connections. And what makes this moment so compelling is that the consequences are only beginning to unfold, revealing outcomes that will reshape relationships, families, and society itself for generations. So, if you want to understand why this is happening and where it inevitably leads, stay with me until the end, because the full picture will change how you see everything. Going forward, there will be no more dates. Men have reached a point of clarity that many never expected them to achieve so thoroughly and so collectively. For years, society bombarded men with messages that their natural instincts were problematic, that their desire to lead, protect, or provide was somehow oppressive or outdated. Terms like toxic masculinity entered everyday language, framing ordinary male behavior as a societal ill that needed correction. At the same time, cultural narratives elevated independence above all else, particularly for women, insisting that fulfillment came from career success, personal freedom, and self sufficiency without reliance on anyone else, especially not a man. Men absorbed these messages quietly at first, observing rather than reacting with outrage. They watched as relationships became battlegrounds where commitment was portrayed as a trap, where traditional roles were mocked, and where equality often translated into one sided expectations. Men noticed that when they offered stability, loyalty, or effort, it was frequently met with dismissal, higher demands, or outright rejection. They saw friends and acquaintances go through divorces that drained finances, custody battles that favored one side disproportionately, and legal systems that seemed designed to penalize rather than balance. These experiences accumulated like data points in a pattern that became impossible to ignore. The result was not anger in the explosive sense, but a calculated withdrawal. Men began prioritizing their own mental health, financial security, and personal growth over the pursuit of romantic partnerships that increasingly felt rigged against them. They rediscovered the value of solitude, realizing that being alone did not equate to loneliness when that solitude came with control over their time, energy, and resources. Hobbies expanded, fitness routines intensified, careers advanced without distraction, and savings grew because there were no shared expenses or expectations of constant provision. Men found that focusing inward brought a level of contentment that chaotic or unbalanced relationships rarely delivered. This shift was not about bitterness toward women as individuals, but about recognizing incompatible incentives in the modern dating landscape. When the costs of engagement outweighed the benefits consistently, the rational choice became disengagement. Men applied the same logic they use in other areas of life. If an investment repeatedly loses value, you stop investing. This withdrawal has created ripple effects that are now visible across social platforms and everyday interactions. Women who once enjoyed abundant attention find themselves in environments where approaches have dried up dramatically. Public spaces feel different because men have learned that even a glance or casual conversation can lead to misinterpretation, recording, or public shaming. Gyms, cafes, and streets have become zones where caution prevails over curiosity. Men have internalized the advice to avoid unnecessary risk, choosing instead to maintain distance and focus on their own paths. The absence of pursuit is not invisible. It registers as a quiet but profound change. Women accustomed to validation through male interest now experience its sudden scarcity, prompting confusion, frustration, and in some cases, open expressions of alarm on social media. The narrative has shifted from questioning the quality of available men to questioning their very presence in the dating sphere. Statistics underscore this transformation with sobering precision. Engagement in seeking casual dates or committed relationships among men has dropped significantly in recent years, reflecting a deliberate choice rather than external barriers. Projections based on current trajectories indicate that a substantial portion of women in prime adult years will navigate life without partners or children, not as an empowered choice for all, but as an unintended outcome of collective male disengagement. These numbers are not abstract. They point to real futures involving economic pressures, emotional isolation, and diminished support networks during life's inevitable challenges. Men, meanwhile, report higher satisfaction in their streamlined lives, where resources stay under their control and peace remains undisturbed. The contrast is stark. One group faces mounting difficulties from a lack of traditional partnerships, while the other thrives by removing those partnerships from the equation. The roots of this divergence trace back through decades of evolving social dynamics. Movements that began with legitimate aims of fairness gradually expanded into frameworks that positioned men as perpetual adversaries. Legal structures in family and civil matters often reflected this imbalance, where outcomes favored one gender in ways that eroded trust. Cultural stories reinforced the idea that men were disposable or inherently flawed, while women were encouraged to demand more without reciprocal obligations. Men observed these patterns over time, noting how promises of equality coexisted with privileges that went unchallenged. When women declared independence loudly, men took it at face value and stepped back to allow that independence to play out fully. The expectation that men would continue providing, despite being told they were not needed, proved unsustainable. Rational self preservation took over. In response, men have embraced minimalism not as deprivation, but as liberation. They eliminate unnecessary complexities, shedding obligations that drain without replenishing. Lives become simpler, more focused, and ultimately more rewarding. Travel, skill building, creative pursuits, and quiet routines replace the constant negotiation and emotional labor of mismatched relationships. This is not rejection of connection in principle, but rejection of connections that consistently underdeliver on mutual respect and value. Men have learned that true contentment arises from internal alignment rather than external approval. They have mastered the discipline of saying no to what diminishes them, choosing instead paths that build strength and serenity. Women now encounter the consequences of these choices in tangible ways. Economic realities bite harder without shared burdens or support. Social circles shrink as peers pair off or withdraw similarly. The promise of endless options fades when those options no longer materialize. Expressions of regret surface more frequently, often framed as bewilderment at why the script has flipped so suddenly. Yet the shift was foreseeable to anyone paying attention to the incentives created over time. Men did not disappear out of spite. They responded logically to a system that devalued their participation. The game changed because the rules no longer made sense for one side, so that side left the field. This moment carries weight because it reveals deeper truths about human nature and societal structures. People thrive in environments of mutual benefit and respect, where roles complement rather than compete destructively. When those conditions erode, withdrawal becomes the default for self protection. Men have demonstrated that they can adapt by turning inward, finding abundance in self reliance. The question now is how society navigates the imbalance that results when one group opts out en masse. The answers will emerge over the coming years, but the direction is clear. Peace has become the priority for many men, and they are not inclined to abandon it lightly. The intensity of this change lies in its quiet execution. No grand protests or declarations marked the beginning. Instead, individual decisions compounded into a cultural exodus. Men simply stopped playing a role that no longer served them. They focused on building lives of substance, where happiness stems from personal achievement and inner calm rather than relational drama. This approach has proven resilient, allowing men to weather economic pressures, social shifts, and personal challenges with greater equanimity. The freedom to direct one's life without constant external demands has revealed itself as profoundly valuable. As these patterns solidify, the broader implications become impossible to dismiss. Families form less frequently, birth rates reflect the shift, and economic dynamics adjust to fewer dual income households in certain demographics. Women face heightened pressure to achieve complete self sufficiency, while men enjoy the advantages of retained resources and undivided attention to their goals. The disparity is not about winning or losing, but about divergent paths chosen in response to incompatible expectations. Men have made their choice, and the evidence suggests it is a durable one. This reality invites reflection on what truly sustains long term fulfillment. Connection remains a fundamental human need, but it must rest on foundations of reciprocity and genuine appreciation. When those foundations crack, the structure collapses and individuals seek stability elsewhere. For men, that stability has come from within, through discipline, purpose, and the deliberate curation of a life free from unnecessary conflict. The result is a growing cohort of men who report genuine contentment, unburdened by the weight of mismatched partnerships. The trajectory points toward further separation unless incentives realign fundamentally. Without acknowledgement of mutual value and respect, the divide widens. Men continue building lives of quiet strength while the absence of their engagement forces others to confront the cost of prior choices. This is the unvarnished outcome of decades of shifting dynamics, a world where men have walked away, not in anger, but in pursuit of peace that proves more attainable alone. The withdrawal of men from the dating market has not occurred in a vacuum. It stems from a long accumulation of experiences where the promised mutual benefits of partnership steadily eroded into one sided arrangements that favored extraction over exchange. Consider the everyday interactions that once formed the foundation of courtship. A man approaching a woman in a public setting with genuine interest now carries an unspoken risk assessment in his mind. He calculates the possibility that his intentions will be misconstrued, recorded without consent, and disseminated to thousands of strangers who will judge him harshly before he has a chance to explain himself. This reality has trained men to default to non engagement. They keep their eyes forward, headphones in, focus on their routines, and let potential connections pass by untouched. The result is a noticeable silence in places where conversation used to flow naturally. Coffee shops, bookstores, parks, and transit hubs have become quieter zones of parallel existence rather than meeting grounds. Men have internalized the lesson that initiative often leads to penalty rather than reward. So they preserve their dignity by preserving their distance. This behavioral shift compounds across millions of individual decisions until it becomes a measurable social phenomenon. Women who previously received consistent attention now report days, weeks, and sometimes months without a single unsolicited compliment, invitation, or even sustained eye contact from men they find attractive. The absence registers as a void that grows louder with time. Social media amplifies this experience because platforms once overflowed with evidence of male pursuit in the form of likes, messages, and public flirtations. That stream has narrowed to a trickle for many. Women post content designed to attract notice, yet the responses come primarily from bots, overseas accounts, or men already in committed relationships seeking distraction rather than genuine partnership. The quality of attention has deteriorated even when quantity remains. What arrives feels transactional, shallow, or predatory rather than respectful and intentional. This leaves women grappling with a paradox. They possess more tools than ever to broadcast their availability and desirability, yet the meaningful engagement they seek has become scarce. Men, on the other hand, describe a different emotional landscape. They speak of relief when they recount stepping away from the chase. The constant performance required to meet escalating standards no longer consumes their mental bandwidth. They no longer rehearse conversations in their heads, wondering which words will trigger offense or dismissal. They no longer budget for dates that serve primarily as auditions rather than shared enjoyment. Finances stabilize because disposable income stays in their accounts instead of funding experiences that rarely lead to reciprocity. Time opens up for pursuits that deliver tangible returns. Mastering a trade, building physical strength, learning languages, investing in assets, traveling solo to places that inspire rather than impress others. These activities reinforce a sense of agency and competence that external validation never quite matched. Men discover that self directed growth produces a deeper satisfaction than intermittent approval from someone whose interest often proves conditional and fleeting. The economic dimension of the shift deserves close examination because it reveals one of the clearest incentives driving male disengagement. Inflation continues to press against household budgets, yet men increasingly opt to shoulder their own costs alone rather than combine resources in partnerships that carry high risk of dissolution. Divorce statistics show that asset division, alimony, and child support obligations frequently leave men in significantly worse financial positions long after separation. Family courts have developed reputations for outcomes that prioritize one parent's claims over balanced consideration. Men observe these patterns through friends, relatives, colleagues, and online communities where stories circulate with sobering consistency. The takeaway is straightforward. Entering a legally binding commitment now resembles signing a contract with asymmetric penalties. When the upside diminishes while the downside balloons, rational actors reduce exposure. Men have done exactly that by declining to enter the arena in the first place. Women face the mirror image of this calculation. Without the traditional safety net of male provision or partnership income, many discover that solo earnings struggle to cover rising rent, groceries, utilities, healthcare, and debt payments accumulated from education or lifestyle choices. Social media captures raw moments of realization. Videos of women calculating monthly expenses only to realize the numbers do not add up without additional streams of support. Some express open frustration at the absence of men willing to step into provider roles they once criticized as outdated. Others frame their appeals in terms of fairness, arguing that men should resume traditional contributions despite decades of messaging that declared such roles unnecessary or oppressive. These pleas often meet silence or deflection because men have already recalibrated their priorities around self preservation rather than rescue. The era when men instinctively place themselves between women and hardship has ended, replaced by an insistence that adults bear the full weight of their own choices. This transition exposes a fundamental mismatch in expectations that developed over generations. Early waves of feminism sought equity in opportunity, education, and professional advancement, goals that commanded broad support. Subsequent cultural turns reframed male traits and behaviors as problems to be managed rather than strengths to be harnessed. Masculinity became synonymous with toxicity in popular discourse, while femininity received reinforcement as inherently virtuous and deserving of protection. Men absorbed the critique and responded not with counter protest but with adaptation. They reduced behaviors labeled problematic, minimized interactions that invited scrutiny, and ultimately withdrew from environments where their presence drew automatic suspicion. Gyms illustrate this dynamic vividly. Men once offered spotting help or casual conversation during workouts. Now, many train alone, avoid eye contact with women in tight athletic wear, and leave promptly after sessions to sidestep any accusation of lingering or staring. The space designed for shared physical improvement has become segmented by caution. Similar caution permeates workplaces, universities, and social gatherings. Men limit compliments to avoid misinterpretation, refrain from mentoring junior female colleagues one on one, and choose group settings over private meetings whenever possible. These micro adjustments aggregate into macro changes. Professional networks narrow for both genders, collaboration opportunities decline, and informal mentorship that once accelerated careers becomes rarer. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. The cost extends beyond dating into broader societal functioning, where trust erosion slows productivity and innovation. Yet men accept these trade offs because the alternative feels riskier. They prioritize avoiding false allegations, career sabotage, or reputational damage over the potential benefits of wider engagement. Women encounter the downstream effects in dating profiles that remain stagnant, messages that go unanswered, and matches that fizzle without progression to real world meetings. The algorithms on applications favor high volume users, but men have reduced swiping frequency or deleted accounts entirely. Many maintain profiles sporadically or keep them dormant as a hedge rather than an active search tool. When engagement does occur, it often lacks investment. Conversations stall after superficial exchanges because men sense familiar patterns, rapid escalation of demands, tests of commitment disguised as casual questions, or subtle framing that positions them as obligated to prove worthiness. Men recognize these tactics from prior experiences and disengage early rather than invest emotional capital in likely dead ends. The cycle reinforces itself. Women receive less serious interest, grow more guarded or demanding in response, and men withdraw further. Beneath these surface behaviors lies a philosophical realignment among men. They have reevaluated the core premise that lifelong partnership represents an essential component of a fulfilled life. Many now view it as optional, contingent on exceptional compatibility rather than default expectation. Solitude, once feared as failure, has been reframed as sovereignty. Men cultivate rich inner worlds through reading, meditation, creative projects, and disciplined routines. They build small but loyal circles of male friends who share values and provide camaraderie without romantic entanglement. These bonds offer emotional support without the volatility that often accompanies heterosexual relationships in the current climate. The result is a growing population of men who report stable mental health, consistent purpose, and genuine contentment despite, or perhaps because of, remaining single. Contrast this with the mounting pressures on women who find themselves navigating adulthood without the relational scaffolding many previous generations took for granted. Economic independence proves harder to achieve when wages stagnate relative to living costs. Housing markets price out single occupants in major cities. Childbearing windows narrow while career demands peak. Social expectations still subtly pressure women toward family formation even as practical pathways diminish. The collision of these forces produces visible distress. Posts lament the difficulty of finding committed partners who match education, income, and lifestyle preferences. Others express regret over past dismissals of stable men who did not meet superficial criteria. A recurring theme emerges: the realization that options once deemed limitless have contracted sharply. Men witness these expressions without the impulse to intervene that characterized earlier eras. They have internalized the message that women are fully capable and prefer to handle matters independently. When appeals for return arrive wrapped in criticism or entitlement, they reinforce the decision to stay gone. Men see the pattern clearly, demand provision after declaring it unnecessary, seek protection after labeling protectors toxic, request commitment after weaponizing independence. The inconsistency erodes remaining goodwill. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not rebuild easily. Men therefore maintain course, investing in themselves rather than attempting to salvage a system that consistently disadvantages them. This dynamic carries profound implications for future generations. Fewer stable two parent households translate into different childhood environments. Children raised primarily by single mothers face higher risks of economic strain, emotional challenges, and reduced exposure to balanced role models. Boys grow up observing male withdrawal as normal rather than aberrant, potentially perpetuating the cycle. Girls absorb messages that prioritize career and autonomy over partnership, only to confront the same scarcity of willing partners when they reach maturity. Society gradually restructures around smaller, more isolated units rather than interconnected families. Economic output may shift as dual earner advantages diminish in certain demographics. Cultural narratives evolve to normalize prolonged singlehood, reframing it as empowerment even when lived experience tells a more complicated story. Men continue thriving in this new arrangement because their needs align more naturally with minimalism and autonomy. They require less external validation to feel secure. Their happiness derives from achievement, competence, and freedom rather than relational status. Removing drama, obligation, and financial leakage creates space for pursuits that compound positively over time. Compound interest on savings grows undisturbed. Physical fitness improves steadily without competing demands on time. Skills sharpen through focused practice rather than fragmented attention. Peace becomes not an occasional visitor, but a default state. Men protect that peace fiercely because they remember the alternative: years spent managing expectations that perpetually shifted upward, negotiating peace instead of living it. The divide widens as each side adapts to its chosen reality. Women double down on independence rhetoric while privately grappling with its limits. Men double down on self reliance while publicly demonstrating its rewards. Neither group appears inclined to reverse course without fundamental changes to incentives, cultural messaging, and institutional frameworks. Until those changes materialize, the pattern holds. Men walk away, find peace, and stay gone. Women confront the consequences, voice frustration, and search for solutions that do not yet exist in sufficient numbers. This is the unfiltered state of affairs as it stands today. The shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, then accelerated as critical mass formed. Men did not declare war or stage marches. They simply stopped participating in a game that no longer rewarded their best efforts. They redirected energy inward and upward, building lives of substance and serenity. The quiet exodus reshapes everything it touches, from birth rates to housing markets to cultural tone. And the most striking aspect remains the absence of anger in the departure. Men leave without fanfare, without demands for apology, without looking back to see who notices. They have found something more valuable than pursuit: peace on their own terms. That discovery proves durable, and it continues to draw more men toward the same conclusion every day. The consequences of this widespread male withdrawal extend far beyond individual loneliness or dating frustrations into the structural fabric of how communities form, economies function, and generations reproduce themselves. When large numbers of men opt out of committed relationships and family formation, the downstream pressures compound in ways that society has not fully prepared for. Birth rates, already trending downward in developed nations, accelerate their decline as fewer stable partnerships lead to fewer planned pregnancies. Demographers tracking these patterns note that the drop is not uniform across demographics, but concentrates among groups where traditional expectations once held strongest. In urban centers, especially, where independence narratives dominate cultural conversation, the combination of delayed marriage, prolonged singlehood, and outright rejection of partnership creates a fertility gap that widens year by year. Governments that once relied on steady population replacement to sustain pension systems, healthcare funding, and labor supply now face actuarial warnings about shrinking working age cohorts supporting growing elderly populations. The math becomes unforgiving. Fewer children born today means fewer taxpayers, innovators, and caregivers tomorrow. Men remain largely insulated from these macro level anxieties because their personal calculus prioritizes immediate control and long term security over collective obligations. They channel resources into personal retirement accounts, health optimization, skill acquisition, and asset accumulation rather than into family building expenses that carry uncertain returns. A man who once might have diverted 20% of his income toward dating, courtship gifts, shared vacations, or eventual household contributions now redirects that capital entirely toward himself. Compound growth on investments accelerates. Emergency funds swell. Debt vanishes faster. Physical and mental resilience strengthens through consistent routines, unencumbered by relational compromise. This financial autonomy reinforces psychological autonomy. Men experience less of the chronic stress associated with provider pressure, relational conflict, or fear of sudden financial ruin through legal separation. Studies on male happiness in recent years show upward trends among never married or long term single men in their 30s and 40s, particularly those who maintain disciplined lifestyles. The data aligns with what men themselves report. Freedom from obligation translates into freedom from resentment, and freedom from resentment allows clearer focus on what actually matters to them. Women, by contrast, encounter a tightening vice of economic and social realities that previous generations could partially offset through partnership. Single income households, especially female led ones, face steeper climbs against housing costs that have outpaced wage growth for 2 decades. Rent in major cities consumes 50 to 60% of take home pay for many young professionals, leaving little margin for savings, leisure, or unexpected emergencies. Childcare expenses, when children enter the picture outside stable two parent structures, devour remaining income at rates that force difficult trade offs between career advancement and family presence. The independence once celebrated as liberating begins to feel like isolation when weekends stretch empty. Illnesses arrive without immediate support, and major life decisions rest solely on one set of shoulders. Social media captures these tensions in unfiltered form. Women documenting budgeting struggles, expressing exhaustion from carrying everything alone, or questioning aloud why the promised fulfillment of total self reliance has not materialized as advertised. The tone shifts from defiance to weariness, from celebration of freedom to quiet acknowledgement of its hidden costs. Men observe these shifts without the reflexive urge to step in that defined earlier cultural norms. They have absorbed the repeated assertion that women neither need nor want male rescue, provision, or leadership. When those assertions were paired with systemic incentives that penalized male participation through family law outcomes, public shaming campaigns, or cultural narratives that framed traditional masculinity as suspect, men adjusted accordingly. They took the declarations at face value and withdrew to protect their own interests. Appeals for men to re enter the dating marketplace now arrive in an environment where trust has eroded to near zero. Men recognize that many such appeals are framed not as invitations to mutual partnership, but as demands for unilateral sacrifice. The language often reveals the disconnect, calls for men to resume paying for dates, providing emotional labor, or shouldering financial burdens, while simultaneously being told that their natural inclinations remain problematic. The contradiction stands out sharply to anyone who has followed the pattern over time. Men therefore maintain distance, reasoning that re engagement under current conditions would repeat past cycles of investment without equitable return. This impasse highlights a deeper fracture in how modern society negotiates gender roles and expectations. Traditional arrangements rested on complementary contributions. Men provided protection and resources, women provided domestic stability and relational continuity. Both sides accepted trade offs because the overall arrangement delivered mutual security and continuity across generations. When one side systematically dismantled its obligations while insisting the other side retain theirs, the compact collapsed. Men did not respond with attempts to renegotiate the terms through confrontation. They exited. The exit proved effective because it required no coordination, no manifesto, no public campaign. Individual men simply recalibrated their behavior based on lived experience and observable incentives. The aggregate effect now reshapes entire social ecosystems. Consider nightlife and social venues as one microcosm of the change. Bars, clubs, and events that once buzzed with mixed gender mingling now show noticeable imbalances. Men attend less frequently or in male only groups, focusing on camaraderie rather than prospecting for romance. Women report arriving at venues expecting attention only to find men clustered together, talking among themselves, or leaving early. The energy shifts from flirtatious possibility to detached observation. Dating applications reflect the same withdrawal. Male activity drops as men conclude that the platforms reward volume over substance, favor superficial traits, and expose users to endless rejection loops or ghosting. Many men maintain minimal profiles or abandon them entirely, preferring organic encounters, if any, over algorithm driven games that feel increasingly rigged. The result is a dating economy where supply of serious male interest has contracted while demand from women remains high, creating scarcity that intensifies competition among women for the remaining engaged men. Those remaining engaged men often belong to narrow demographic slices, exceptionally high earners, unusually charismatic personalities, or men who either reject or remain unaware of the broader cultural signals. This concentration funnels attention toward a tiny percentage of the male population, leaving the majority of women competing for a shrinking pool of viable partners who meet modern criteria of height, income, emotional availability, and ideological alignment. The mathematics of preference matching become brutal under these constraints. When 90% of women express interest in the top 20% of men by conventional metrics, the inevitable outcome is widespread dissatisfaction. Men outside that elite tier recognize their position and further reduce participation, reasoning that effort directed toward improbable success is better spent elsewhere. The feedback loop tightens. More withdrawal leads to greater scarcity, which leads to heightened selectivity, which leads to still more withdrawal. Meanwhile, men who have fully embraced singlehood cultivate lifestyles that appear enviable from the outside. They travel light, unburdened by shared schedules or family obligations. They maintain homes optimized for personal comfort rather than guest accommodation or child safety. They pursue fitness with religious consistency, achieving physiques and endurance levels that demand years of undisturbed discipline. They build side businesses, invest in real estate, master technical skills, or immerse themselves in creative projects that yield both satisfaction and potential income. Social lives revolve around male friendships forged through shared interests rather than romantic pursuit. These friendships provide laughter, accountability, and support without the volatility that often accompanies mixed gender dynamics. The overall picture is one of deliberate simplicity yielding outsized personal returns. Men describe it as finally living for themselves after years of living in service to expectations that never reciprocated. Women navigating the same years often face a different ledger. Career progression demands longer hours and geographic mobility, delaying family formation until biological clocks create urgency. When partnership does not materialize on the desired timeline, options narrow to fertility treatments, single motherhood by choice, or acceptance of childlessness. Each path carries trade offs that previous generations mitigated through earlier and more reliable pairing. The cultural narrative that frames these outcomes as empowering choices clashes with the lived experience of many women who express private regret or public frustration. Online spaces filled with discussions dissecting where the disconnect occurred, why stable men seem unavailable, and how independence rhetoric may have oversold its benefits while underselling its solitude. These conversations rarely produce actionable solutions because the incentives remain misaligned. Men see no compelling reason to re enter a system that previously penalized them, while women hesitate to dismantle the independence framework that still defines much of contemporary identity. The generational transmission of these patterns promises further divergence. Boys raised in single mother households or environments where male withdrawal is normalized absorb different lessons about relationships than their fathers or grandfathers did. They witness women managing alone, men staying distant, and cultural messaging that continues to frame masculinity with suspicion. Many grow into young adulthood already skeptical of partnership, having internalized risk avoidance as a core strategy. Girls in similar environments learn to prioritize self sufficiency from an early age, often viewing male involvement as optional or even burdensome. When these cohorts reach dating age, mutual suspicion compounds the existing divide. Early data from younger generations shows even steeper declines in relationship formation, suggesting that the current withdrawal may represent not a temporary correction, but a new equilibrium. Society as a whole adjusts slowly to this emerging reality. Housing markets shift towards smaller units suited to single occupants. Consumer products target individual rather than family needs. Entertainment and media increasingly normalize prolonged singlehood as the default rather than the exception. Policy discussions begin to grapple with supporting aging populations without traditional family structures, exploring expanded social safety nets, immigration adjustments, or incentives for family formation that avoid coercive framing. Yet these conversations often sidestep the root cultural and incentive misalignments that produce the shift in the first place. Until those misalignments receive honest reckoning, the behavioral patterns are likely to persist and deepen. Men, having tasted the alternative, show little inclination to abandon it. Peace, once an abstract concept, has become concrete. Undisturbed sleep, unencumbered finances, purposeful days, and freedom from chronic negotiation. They guard that peace jealously because they remember its opposite. The decision to walk away was not impulsive or emotional. It was reasoned, tested, and validated through results. More men reach the same conclusion every month, quietly closing one chapter and opening another defined by self determination. The path they have chosen proves sustainable, rewarding, and increasingly populated. As long as the external environment offers no compelling counter incentive, that path will continue to widen. The cultural machinery that once propelled men toward marriage and family now operates in reverse, actively discouraging the very behaviors it used to reward. Media portrayals of committed relationships frequently frame them as sources of endless conflict, comedic incompetence on the part of husbands, or outright entrapment. And sitcoms, reality shows, and streaming series routinely depict fathers and husbands as bumbling obstacles to be managed rather than competent partners worthy of respect. When positive male role models appear, they often come packaged with disclaimers about privilege or outdated values. Boys and young men growing up immersed in this content absorb a subtle but persistent lesson. Long term commitment invites ridicule, financial risk, and emotional exhaustion. The counter narrative of rewarding balanced partnerships receives far less airtime. As a result, many young men enter adulthood already preconditioned to view marriage as a high stakes gamble with poor odds rather than a natural milestone. This conditioning interacts powerfully with real world observations. Young men see older relatives, friends of friends, and public figures navigate separations that strip them of assets, access to children, and peace of mind. They read court documents shared online, listen to podcasts dissecting alimony calculations, and scroll through forums cataloging the financial wreckage left behind after no fault divorce proceedings. The takeaway solidifies early. The legal and social environment no longer treats marriage as a mutual enterprise protected by balanced safeguards. Instead, it functions more like a contract where one party can unilaterally dissolve it while the other bears disproportionate costs. When young men weigh that reality against the alternative of remaining single, the scales tip decisively toward independence. They choose to build wealth, health, and networks that cannot be halved by judicial decree or eroded by prolonged conflict. Women in the same age cohort often receive the opposite cultural programming. Messages emphasize career as the primary path to security and identity, with partnership presented as an optional bonus rather than a foundational structure. Education and professional advancement receive relentless promotion as the route to empowerment, while early family formation is subtly or overtly portrayed as a limitation on potential. Many women internalize this hierarchy and delay serious dating until credentials and income stabilize, often pushing partnership considerations into their late 20s or 30s. By that point, the pool of men who share similar timelines, values, and life stages has shrunk considerably. The men still actively seeking committed relationships tend to cluster in specific subcultures, religious communities, certain ethnic groups, or regions less saturated with urban independence ideology, leaving mainstream secular women competing for a narrower segment of willing partners. The resulting mismatch produces visible frustration in online spaces dedicated to dating and relationships. Women describe exhaustive searches for men who meet baseline criteria, only to encounter disinterest, inconsistency, or outright avoidance. Men who do engage frequently maintain emotional distance, keeping interactions light and non-committal to preserve their exit options. The dynamic creates a feedback spiral where women raise standards further in self defense, which in turn accelerates male withdrawal. What begins as reasonable selectivity morphs into criteria so narrow that even high value men struggle to qualify without constant performance. Men recognize the pattern and conclude that the effort required to pass perpetual tests exceeds any realistic payoff. They redirect that effort toward pursuits with clearer returns: career ladders, physical transformation, financial independence, personal mastery. This redirection manifests in visible lifestyle differences that become harder to ignore over time. Single men in their 30s increasingly own property outright or carry minimal mortgages because they avoided the dual income dependency trap that often precedes divorce. They maintain low overheads, travel extensively on flexible schedules, and invest aggressively in markets or side ventures. Their social calendars fill with activities chosen purely for enjoyment rather than signaling status to potential mates. Gym attendance becomes non-negotiable routine rather than occasional vanity project. Nutrition, sleep, and recovery protocols turn obsessive because no external demands compete for attention. The cumulative effect produces men who appear markedly more composed, capable, and content than their partnered counterparts burdened by relational overhead. Women attempting to navigate the same life stage frequently report the inverse experience. Extended singlehood stretches into periods where career success coexists with mounting personal strain. Social circles contract as friends pair off, move away, or focus on family life. Dating fatigue sets in after years of mismatched interactions, ghosting cycles, and unmet expectations. The promise that professional achievement would automatically unlock fulfilling personal life begins to ring hollow when evenings and weekends feel emptier than anticipated. Attempts to pivot toward partnership later in the timeline collide with men who have already settled into self sufficient patterns and show little interest in disruption. The men who remain open to dating often carry their own scars from prior experiences, approaching new connections with heavy vetting and slow escalation that frustrates women accustomed to faster progression. These divergent trajectories crystallize into two parallel societies occupying the same physical spaces but experiencing radically different emotional and material realities. One group, predominantly men who walked away, reports record levels of life satisfaction driven by autonomy, financial security, and freedom from drama. Surveys of never married men in midlife show declining desire for marriage over time rather than increasing regret. Many explicitly state that they would only consider partnership under conditions so favorable and reciprocal that they border on theoretical. The bar sits extraordinarily high because the downside risk remains vivid while the upside feels increasingly replaceable through other forms of connection and meaning. The other group confronts a growing sense of contingency. Economic security proves fragile when reliant solely on one income stream in an inflationary environment. Emotional support networks, thin as peers, prioritize their own families or withdraw similarly. Health challenges, when they arise, lack the immediate buffer of a committed co pilot. Future planning becomes more anxiety laden without the built in redundancy that dual adult households provide. The independence celebrated in youth starts to feel like exposure in middle age, particularly when biological realities and market pressures converge. Social media becomes a mirror reflecting both the successes of self reliant men and the struggles of women attempting similar paths without equivalent insulation. Policy attempts to address these imbalances often miss the mark because they focus on symptoms rather than root incentives. Proposals for subsidized childcare, paid family leave, or tax credits for marriage treat the downstream effects while leaving the upstream cultural and legal disincentives untouched. Men view such measures skeptically, recognizing that they rarely balance the ledger in cases of dissolution. Family courts continue to operate under frameworks developed decades ago when gender roles aligned differently and economic realities favored different outcomes. Until those frameworks undergo fundamental reform, equal presumptions of custody, equitable asset division based on actual contribution, caps on lifetime alimony, the rational calculus for men remains unchanged. Avoidance is safer than participation. Cultural gatekeepers show little appetite for examining this reality head on. Discussions of declining marriage rates and falling fertility usually pivot quickly to external factors: economic inequality, housing costs, climate anxiety, while sidestepping the role of eroded trust and misaligned incentives between genders. When male withdrawal receives mention, it often gets framed as immaturity, entitlement, or backlash rather than reasoned self preservation. This framing reinforces the cycle. Men feel further invalidated, double down on disengagement, and accelerate the very trends commentators lament. Honest reckoning would require acknowledging that both sides contributed to the breakdown through shifting expectations, legal imbalances, and cultural messaging that devalued mutual obligation, and that rebuilding requires reciprocal concessions rather than unilateral demands. In the meantime, men continue constructing lives of deliberate minimalism elevated to art form. They curate environments free of clutter, obligation, and emotional volatility. Possessions serve function rather than status. Time protects recovery and growth rather than endless appeasement. Relationships, when pursued at all, remain strictly platonic or extremely selective. The discipline required to maintain the standard produces compounding advantages: sharper focus, stronger physique, deeper expertise, larger net worth, calmer nervous system. Men reach points where external partnership would represent net loss rather than gain because their baseline contentment already exceeds what most relationships deliver under current conditions. Women who recognize the pattern sometimes attempt course corrections, lowering criteria, signaling openness to traditional roles, emphasizing mutual respect. But these efforts frequently arrive too late or meet skepticism born of accumulated experience. Men have learned to distinguish genuine shifts from tactical adjustments prompted by scarcity. They prioritize observable behavior over declared intentions, pattern recognition over promises. Trust rebuilds slowly when it rebuilds at all, and the current environment offers few catalysts for acceleration. The broader society begins to feel the weight of these choices in aggregate. Schools adapt to higher proportions of single parent or single income children. Healthcare systems brace for aging populations supported by fewer adult children. Innovation pipelines adjust to talent pools shaped by different life priorities. Cultural tone shifts toward acceptance of permanent singlehood as normative rather than transitional. Entertainment increasingly centers solitary protagonists or non traditional arrangements because those reflect lived experience for growing numbers. Through it all, men maintain their course with quiet consistency. They have tested the alternative to pursuit and found it superior for their temperament and risk profile. Peace is no longer a hoped for state, but an achieved one. defended daily through disciplined choices. The longer that peace endures, the less incentive exists to trade it away. Each year of undisturbed progress reinforces the original decision. More men arrive at the same conclusion, not through coordinated movement, but through parallel logic applied to shared evidence. The path widens because the destination proves worthwhile. Society may eventually adapt institutions, narratives, and incentives to narrow the divide. Until then, the separation continues, with one side thriving in chosen solitude and the other grappling with the full implications of independence without reciprocity. The experiment plays out in real time, and the results speak louder than any theory. The erosion of shared moral and ethical frameworks has accelerated the separation in ways that transcend economics or law. Where previous generations operated under broadly agreed upon notions of duty, honor, and reciprocal sacrifice, contemporary culture promotes radical individualism as the highest virtue for everyone simultaneously. This creates an impossible equation. If every person prioritizes self above all else without exception, then no one remains available to fulfill the complementary roles that once made long term partnerships viable and stable. Men, having internalized this ethos more thoroughly in recent years, apply it with particular rigor. They treat their time, energy, attention, and resources as non negotiable assets rather than communal goods to be distributed on demand. The result is a generation of men who view any request for unreciprocated investment, emotional, financial, or temporal, as an infringement rather than an invitation. Women frequently encounter this boundary as coldness or selfishness when they attempt to re engage after years of signaling independence. The frustration stems from mismatched timelines and shifting premises. Many women spent their 20s asserting that they needed nothing from men, building careers, social capital, and personal brands on the foundation of self sufficiency rhetoric. When circumstances change in their 30s, biological clocks ticking louder, economic headwinds strengthening, social validation drying up, they pivot towards seeking partnership without fully dismantling the prior messaging. Men receive these overtures through the filter of accumulated history. They remember the lectures on toxicity, the public shaming campaigns, the legal precedents that turned commitment into liability. The pivot feels less like evolution and more like convenience, prompting guarded responses or outright rejection. Trust does not reset automatically when external conditions shift. It requires consistent demonstration over extended periods, something the current environment rarely allows. This trust deficit manifests most clearly in the pace and depth of modern courtship when it does occur. Men who remain open to dating adopt protocols that prioritize verification over velocity. They insist on extended observation before emotional investment, demand transparency about past behavior, and maintain strict boundaries around finances from the outset. Conversations move slowly, testing for consistency between words and actions rather than accelerating toward intimacy. Women accustomed to faster progression or abundant options often interpret this caution as disinterest or game playing. The mismatch in tempo widens the gap further. What men see as prudent risk management, women experience as rejection or emotional unavailability. Neither side fully grasps the other's reasoning because the foundational assumptions have diverged so sharply. Men build their caution on observable patterns rather than abstract theory. They note how frequently initial enthusiasm gives way to escalating demands once commitment signals appear. They track the way compliments once welcomed now trigger suspicion of ulterior motives. They remember instances where vulnerability led to weaponization rather than closeness. These data points accumulate into heuristics that guide behavior. Assume good faith only after prolonged evidence, protect assets at all costs, exit at the first sign of inconsistency. The heuristics prove effective because they minimize downside exposure while preserving upside potential through non relational channels. Men report fewer regrets and greater life control when operating under these rules. Women navigating this landscape face a steeper learning curve because the incentives they once relied upon have inverted. Validation through male attention, once plentiful, now requires significantly more effort with lower guaranteed returns. Attempts to broadcast desirability through appearance, social media curation, lifestyle signaling yield diminishing engagement from high quality men who have already opted out. The men who do respond often belong to categories that raise red flags for long term compatibility: chronic daters, those with unresolved issues, or individuals seeking short term convenience rather than partnership. Sorting through this noise consumes time and emotional energy without proportional reward. The process leaves many women questioning whether the pursuit remains worth the investment when solitude, though lonely at times, at least delivers predictability and self control. Predictability emerges as one of the most undervalued benefits men claim from their withdrawal. Life without constant relational negotiation follows rhythms that feel restorative rather than draining. Mornings begin with personal rituals rather than compromise. Evenings end according to internal clocks rather than external expectations. Decisions, large and small, remain unilateral, eliminating the friction of perpetual consensus seeking. This predictability fosters psychological safety that many men describe as previously unattainable in relationships characterized by shifting goalposts. The absence of drama becomes its own form of abundance, allowing mental bandwidth once consumed by conflict resolution to redirect toward creativity, learning, and recovery. Physical and mental health metrics reflect this redirection. Men who maintain long term singlehood frequently exhibit lower cortisol levels, better sleep quality, and more consistent training adherence than their partnered peers burdened by relational stress. They pursue medical checkups proactively rather than reactively because health represents one of the few non negotiable priorities left under their direct control. Nutrition becomes precise rather than reactive to shared preferences or convenience. Recovery protocols, sauna sessions, mobility work, meditation integrate seamlessly without negotiation. The body becomes a project rather than a shared asset, yielding visible improvements in strength, composition, and resilience that reinforce the original decision to prioritize self. Women attempting parallel optimization often encounter structural barriers that men sidestep. Career demands clash more intensely with biological imperatives when partnership remains elusive. Time allocated to professional networking, skill building, and advancement competes directly with fertility windows and relationship cultivation. The zero sum nature of these trade offs creates chronic pressure absent in male experience. Single women report higher rates of burnout in high achievement fields because the absence of a supportive co pilot amplifies every setback. Emotional labor that might once have been shared now falls entirely inward, increasing vulnerability to anxiety and isolation when external validation sources contract. Social ecosystems adapt unevenly to these pressures. Male dominated spaces, certain gyms, hobbyist groups, professional networks grow more insular as men reinforce boundaries against perceived intrusion. Female dominated or mixed spaces sometimes evolve into echo chambers where grievances about male absence circulate without counterbalancing perspectives. Cross-pollination diminishes, reducing opportunities for organic correction of misconceptions. Friendships between genders become rarer and more cautious, often mediated through group contexts rather than one on one vulnerability. The overall social fabric frays at the edges, replaced by parallel networks that rarely intersect meaningfully. Technology accelerates this parallelization. Dating platforms, once bridges, now function more like sorting mechanisms that highlight incompatibility faster than compatibility. Algorithms optimize for engagement rather than successful pairing, rewarding drama and superficial traits while burying substance. Men reduce participation because the platforms extract time and self esteem without delivering proportional value. Women increase effort in response to scarcity, creating asymmetric investment that further alienates high caliber men. The cycle entrenches digital fatigue on both sides while failing to produce sustainable connections at scale. Alternative pathways to meaning emerge in response. Men increasingly find purpose through mastery domains that demand solitary discipline. Martial arts, music production, software development, long distance endurance sports, investment research. These pursuits offer clear feedback loops, measurable progress, and intrinsic reward structures that relationships under current conditions often lack. Achievement in these arenas provides the validation once sought through romantic success, but without the accompanying volatility. Communities form around shared competence rather than shared domesticity, delivering camaraderie that feels cleaner and more durable. Women gravitate toward parallel structures, professional networks, wellness circles, creative collectives that emphasize empowerment through collective female experience. These spaces provide support and identity reinforcement, but rarely bridge the gender divide. The result is two increasingly separate spheres of meaning making that coexist within the same cities but interact minimally. Shared public spaces become transactional zones rather than connective tissue. Conversations stay surface level to avoid friction. Eye contact shortens. The social temperature cools noticeably. Institutions begin registering the shift through enrollment patterns, workforce dynamics, and consumption habits. Universities see gender imbalances tilt further in certain fields as men opt for trades, entrepreneurship, or remote work that maximizes autonomy. Corporate cultures adjust to higher turnover among men who prioritize lifestyle over ladder climbing when relational obligations disappear. Consumer markets segment more sharply. Products once marketed to couples now target individuals with disposable income and time freedom. Real estate developers prioritize smaller, high end units over family sized homes in urban cores. The built environment slowly reshapes around the new demographic reality. Religious and spiritual communities represent one of the few remaining arenas where traditional pairing incentives persist with some strength. Men and women who maintain active faith participation often form partnerships at rates far exceeding secular averages. Shared values around duty, sacrifice, and permanence create alignment that secular culture struggles to replicate. These communities grow in relative influence as secular singlehood solidifies elsewhere. The contrast highlights how much of the broader withdrawal traces back to the absence of binding moral frameworks capable of overriding individual cost benefit analysis. Secular society experiments with substitute frameworks, polyamory, intentional communities, chosen family models, but these alternatives rarely achieve the stability or scale of traditional monogamous pairing under reciprocal conditions. Most dissolve under the same pressures of misaligned incentives and individual priority that fractured conventional relationships. The search for viable alternatives continues, yet none has yet demonstrated durability at population level. Men remain largely indifferent to these experiments because their current arrangement already satisfies core needs. They have outsourced reproduction to those who still choose it, accepted lower societal fertility as someone else's problem, and focused on personal legacy through other channels: mentorship, creative output, financial independence that benefits future kin selectively rather than automatically. The mindset represents a clean break from collectivist assumptions about male duty. Men now ask what serves their flourishing first, extending help only when it aligns with that priority rather than out of default obligation. This philosophical pivot proves remarkably sticky. Once men experience years of undisturbed peace, prosperity, and purpose, the psychological cost of re entering relational risk feels prohibitive. Each additional year of successful singlehood raises the bar higher. Regret remains rare because the alternative path delivers compounding returns rather than diminishing ones. The decision calcifies into identity, not anti woman, not misogynistic, simply pro self in an environment that no longer rewards pro other. Society may reach a tipping point where aggregate outcomes force institutional reckoning, major family law reform, cultural narrative shifts, economic incentives realigned toward mutual investment. Until that reckoning arrives, if it arrives, men continue walking their chosen path. They build quietly, live deliberately, and guard their peace with the same consistency that once characterized their pursuit of partnership. The era of automatic male provision has closed. What replaces it is self provision, elevated to principle, defended daily, and increasingly embraced as the rational default. The experiment continues unfolding. One side demonstrates the viability of radical autonomy, the other confronts its practical limits. Neither appears poised to reverse course without fundamental changes to the operating system of modern gender relations. The separation deepens, the consequences accumulate, and the quiet exodus rolls forward under its own momentum. The psychological architecture that once supported male pursuit has undergone a near complete demolition and reconstruction. Where men previously derived much of their sense of worth from being chosen, needed, and capable of solving problems for a partner, that feedback loop has been severed. The culture spent years dismantling the provider protector archetype, labeling it patriarchal baggage, then wondering why men stopped volunteering for the role. Once the external applause for sacrifice dried up and the internal reward system recalibrated, men discovered they could generate validation internally through competence, discipline, and tangible progress in domains they actually control. A deadlift personal record, a completed certification, a portfolio that grows quarter after quarter, a bank account that compounds without interruption. These metrics deliver dopamine hits that feel cleaner and more reliable than intermittent romantic approval ever did. The shift represents not a rejection of value, but a relocation of where value is sourced. Men now treat self mastery as the primary currency rather than relational status. This internal sourcing creates a feedback loop of its own. Each small win reinforces the decision to stay solo. Each avoided relational landmine confirms the wisdom of caution. Over months and years, the loop strengthens until the thought of re entering the dating arena feels like voluntarily stepping into a minefield after learning to walk safely around it. The aversion is not irrational fear, it is pattern based risk assessment. Men have cataloged enough instances of initial charm giving way to criticism, of investment met with escalation, of loyalty rewarded with exit, that the probability distribution tilts heavily against positive outcomes. When the expected value of an action remains negative over repeated trials, rational agents cease performing it. Men have ceased performing courtship at scale because the numbers no longer justify the expenditure. Women who attempt to understand this calculus often frame it as immaturity or fear of commitment rather than adaptive strategy. The framing itself widens the chasm because it dismisses the evidentiary basis for the withdrawal. Men point to concrete data, divorce initiation rates hovering near 70% when women file, asset division patterns that routinely favor one side, custody outcomes that default to maternal preference unless extreme circumstances exist, social media pylons that destroy reputations on accusation alone. These are not hypotheticals. They are documented patterns visible across jurisdictions and socioeconomic strata. When women counter with assertions that not all women behave this way, men respond with the same logic they apply to any high risk environment. The existence of safe actors does not negate the prevalence of dangerous ones, and absent reliable screening mechanisms, the prudent course is avoidance. The conversation stalls because one side operates from lived statistical reality, while the other appeals to exception or moral suasion. Moral suasion loses potency when the audience has already internalized that morality is applied asymmetrically. Men watched as public discourse condemned male misbehavior with swiftness and severity, while excusing or reframing parallel female behavior as empowerment or justified response. The double standard became too glaring to ignore. Phrases like believe women morphed from protection against genuine abuse into blanket presumption that shifted burden of proof onto the accused. Men adapted by removing themselves from situations where presumption could be weaponized. They stopped offering unsolicited help, minimized compliments, avoided private mentorship, refrained from physical proximity in public spaces. Each micro withdrawal compounds until macro separation becomes the default state of affairs. Public spaces reflect this new equilibrium most visibly. Sidewalks, elevators, transit cars, and waiting areas now carry an unspoken tension. Men keep greater physical distance, maintain neutral facial expressions, and direct attention toward phones or forward gaze rather than scanning for eye contact. The old game of subtle approach signals has been replaced by mutual non engagement. Women notice the cooling atmosphere and interpret it variably, some as rudeness, others as evidence that men have indeed checked out, still others as confirmation that their earlier boundary setting worked too well. Whatever the interpretation, the outcome remains consistent. Fewer spontaneous interactions, less casual flirtation, diminished organic pathway to connection. The loss of those low stakes entry points accelerates reliance on digital platforms, which in turn amplify the problems already discussed. Digital platforms themselves evolve in response to the withdrawal. Application developers introduce features designed to rekindle male participation, boosted visibility for active users, curated daily matches, premium perks that promise better odds. But the underlying incentive structure remains unchanged. Women still hold disproportionate power to initiate rejection loops, report profiles with minimal justification, and curate feeds that prioritize superficial metrics. Men who return briefly often leave again after encountering the same dynamics. High volume of low quality attention, rapid devaluation once investment begins, ghosting after emotional labor has been extracted. The churn rate for male users climbs while female retention holds steadier because the platform still provides validation even when it fails to deliver partnership. The business model thrives on prolonged engagement rather than successful outcomes, so the mismatch persists by design. Outside the applications, a parallel digital ecosystem flourishes among men who have left the mainstream dating game entirely. Forums, private discords, Telegram channels, and content creators build communities around self improvement, financial independence, Stoic philosophy, physical discipline, and realistic analysis of gender dynamics. These spaces function as echo chambers of a different kind, not to foster bitterness, but to reinforce successful strategies for thriving solo. Men share routines that produce results, warn against common traps, celebrate milestones reached without relational compromise. The tone varies from analytical to motivational, but rarely descends into outright hostility. The focus stays on what works rather than what was lost. Participation in these communities provides social proof that the chosen path is neither fringe nor failing. It is populated, effective, and growing. Women who stumble into these spaces often react with shock or anger, interpreting the candor as misogyny rather than self protective realism. The reaction rarely prompts introspection about how the broader culture arrived at this point. Instead, it fuels further entrenchment on both sides. Men see the outrage as confirmation that honest discussion remains unwelcome, so they lock the doors tighter. Women see the closed communities as evidence of resentment, reinforcing the narrative that men need fixing rather than understanding. The mutual incomprehension deepens the divide into something structural rather than merely attitudinal. Structural separation manifests in housing patterns as well. Single men increasingly cluster in affordable exurban or rural areas where cost of living allows faster wealth accumulation and greater personal space. They purchase modest properties outright or with minimal debt, customize them for solitary efficiency, home gyms, workshops, quiet offices, and build equity that appreciates undisturbed. Women remain concentrated in urban cores where career opportunities cluster, but housing costs devour income at accelerating rates. The geographic divergence reduces chance encounters further. Cities become female majority zones in certain age bands, while surrounding regions tilt male as men seek lower overhead and higher autonomy. Commuting patterns, weekend migration, and even voting behavior begin to reflect this spatial sorting. Economic sorting follows suit. Men gravitate toward fields that reward individual output over collaborative theater, software engineering, trades, entrepreneurship, remote consulting, financial trading, domains where performance trumps politics and compensation ties directly to results. Women cluster in sectors that emphasize social coordination, credentialism, and institutional stability, education, healthcare administration, human resources, nonprofit management, certain corporate tracks. The occupational divergence reinforces income and lifestyle gaps that make cross matching harder. A man earning six figures with low expenses and maximal time freedom has little overlap with a woman earning comparable income but carrying higher fixed costs and relational expectations. The practical compatibility window narrows even among those who might otherwise share values. Values themselves diverge under these pressures. Men lean toward frameworks that emphasize personal responsibility, stoicism, outcome orientation, and skepticism of collective narratives. Women gravitate toward paradigms that stress systemic factors, emotional authenticity, communal support, and progressive reform. The philosophical split makes casual conversation feel like translation between languages. Shared premises disappear. Humor styles misalign. Risk tolerance differs. Future orientation contrasts. One side plans for worst case independence, the other for collaborative best case scenarios that grow less probable. The absence of common ground turns even neutral topics into minefields. Children raised in this bifurcated landscape inherit the split worldview. Boys see fathers or male relatives either absent, disengaged, or thriving in deliberate solitude. They learn early that self reliance trumps dependence, that emotional exposure carries risk, that institutional promises of fairness often prove hollow. Girls see mothers or female relatives navigating solo adulthood with varying degrees of strain, hear constant messaging about empowerment through independence, and absorb cautionary tales about male unreliability. Both cohorts reach maturity with lower baseline expectations for partnership and higher thresholds for trust. Early dating patterns among Gen Z and younger already show steeper declines in relationship formation. Earlier adoption of singlehood as default, and greater comfort with transactional or temporary arrangements over permanent commitment. The trend suggests the current separation may represent not a temporary disequilibrium, but the establishment of a new multi generational norm. Institutions respond sluggishly because acknowledging the root causes requires confronting uncomfortable trade offs. Governments debate pronatalist policies, baby bonuses, housing subsidies, extended leave, but these measures treat fertility collapse as an economic problem rather than a relational one. Legal scholars propose family law reforms, presumptive joint custody, alimony caps tied to actual need, shorter durations, but political momentum stalls when framed as concessions to men. Cultural producers experiment with narratives that romanticize singlehood for both genders. Yet audience reception remains mixed because lived experience often contradicts the polished messaging. The inertia preserves the status quo long enough for behavioral patterns to harden further. Men, meanwhile, continue refining their architecture of autonomy. They experiment with semi nomadic lifestyles, digital nomad visas, seasonal relocation, property portfolios in low tax jurisdictions. They build passive income streams that decouple survival from labor. They cultivate micro communities of like minded men who meet irregularly for accountability rather than daily entanglement. They practice voluntary discomfort, fasting protocols, cold exposure, extended silence retreats to strengthen mental resilience against future uncertainty. Each layer of preparation makes retreat from society's relational expectations feel less like deprivation and more like strategic positioning. The cumulative effect is a growing cohort of men who view partnership not as destiny, but as elective surgery, something to be considered only after exhaustive risk reward analysis and only when conditions approximate ideal. Most never reach that threshold because the baseline of solo life keeps improving. Peace compounds, competence compounds, capital compounds, contentment compounds. The longer the compounding runs uninterrupted, the less incentive exists to interrupt it. Society therefore faces a future where a significant percentage of adults live parallel but minimally intersecting lives. One track prioritizes individual sovereignty and demonstrates its viability. The other grapples with the practical ceiling of sovereignty when biological, economic, and emotional realities collide. Neither track appears inclined to merge without major realignment of incentives, institutions, and cultural premises. Until that realignment occurs, if it occurs, the quiet walkaway continues, gathering momentum with each man who calculates the numbers, tests the alternative, and decides the solitude outweighs the gamble. The long term societal architecture is now visibly buckling under the weight of this sustained withdrawal. Fertility rates have plunged below replacement levels in nation after nation, not as a temporary blip, but as a structural feature of the current incentive landscape. Governments that once assumed steady population growth to fund entitlements and sustain labor markets now confront actuarial nightmares. Pension systems projected to run dry within decades. Healthcare infrastructures strained by aging cohorts without corresponding younger replacements. Housing markets distorted by persistent demand for single occupancy units, while family sized homes sit underutilized in certain suburbs. The demographic inversion is not abstract policy debate. It is concrete math that forces hard choices. Immigration becomes the default pressure valve, yet cultural cohesion frays when newcomers arrive into a society already segmented by gender and lifestyle divergence. Native born populations shrink proportionally, shifting political power toward older voters who prioritize short term stability over long term renewal. The feedback accelerates. Fewer children today means even fewer potential parents tomorrow, entrenching the cycle. Men remain largely detached from these macro anxieties because their personal horizon has narrowed to self preservation and optional legacy rather than a collective continuity. They contribute taxes, consume modestly, innovate in niches, but they no longer see themselves as default guarantors of societal reproduction. The provider instinct, once culturally hardwired, has been deliberately uninstalled. Men now view children as high cost, high risk optional projects rather than inevitable milestones. Those who do choose fatherhood often do so under tightly controlled conditions. Later in life, with partners who demonstrate exceptional alignment or through selective sperm donation arrangements that preserve autonomy. The default posture is non participation. This stance is not nihilistic, it is pragmatic. Men calculate that the probability of stable family formation under present conditions remains too low to justify the investment when alternative paths to meaning and impact already exist. Women, positioned at the center of the fertility contraction, experience the consequences more acutely and immediately. Biological timelines do not bend to career ladders or shifting social norms. Many who delayed family formation in pursuit of professional credentials or personal exploration now face shortened windows and reduced partner pools. Fertility clinics report surging demand for egg freezing, IVF cycles, and donor sperm among women in their mid to late 30s who once assumed partnership would materialize organically. Single motherhood by choice gains cultural visibility, yet remains statistically rare and economically punishing for most. The choice to proceed alone carries steep trade offs: doubled financial burden, absence of co parenting redundancy, heightened vulnerability during child rearing years. Public narratives celebrate these decisions as ultimate empowerment, but private conversations reveal exhaustion, second guessing, and quiet acknowledgement that the path is far harder than advertised. The contrast between public framing and private reality grows sharper over time. Media continues to push stories of thriving single women conquering boardrooms and building empires. Yet the same outlets increasingly run features on rising loneliness epidemics, delayed milestones, and the search for meaning outside traditional structures. The dissonance creates cognitive strain. Women who internalized the message that independence equals freedom now confront the reality that freedom without reliable support networks can feel like exposure. Social circles shrink as friends enter different life phases. Holidays highlight absences. Major life events, illness, job loss, parental decline arrive without the built in buffer once provided by committed partnerships. The cumulative weight presses harder as years accumulate. Men observe this unfolding without the impulse to intervene that characterized past generations. They have internalized the repeated assertion that women are fully capable, prefer autonomy, and resent traditional male roles. When distress signals emerge, whether through viral posts, survey data, or personal anecdotes, men respond with the same logic applied to any mismatched system. If the design no longer serves mutual benefit, exit remains the rational course. Appeals framed as demands for return to old patterns meet resistance because they rarely include reciprocal concessions. Men see little evidence that the cultural or legal environment has shifted enough to warrant renewed risk exposure. The asymmetry persists. Women retain veto power over commitment, while men bear disproportionate downside in dissolution. Until that asymmetry corrects meaningfully, the withdrawal holds. This impasse forces a broader philosophical question about what constitutes a viable social contract between genders in advanced economies. The old contract, mutual sacrifice for shared progeny and security, relied on complementary incentives and enforceable norms. When one side systematically reduced its obligations while the other retained liability, the contract dissolved. Attempts to revive it through moral exhortation or policy patches fail because the underlying incentives remain misaligned. Men have demonstrated they can flourish without the contract. Women have yet to prove the same at population scale when biological and economic realities converge. The asymmetry in adaptability becomes one of the defining features of the era. Adaptability manifests differently across domains. Men leverage technology, mobility, and minimalism to insulate themselves from volatility. Remote work decouples income from geographic constraints. Digital nomadism allows tax optimization and lifestyle arbitrage. Decentralized finance and crypto adoption provide hedges against fiat instability. These tools amplify individual sovereignty in ways previous generations could not access. Men exploit the advantages aggressively, building parallel systems that bypass traditional dependencies. The result is a growing class of men who achieve upper middle or affluent status while maintaining near zero relational overhead. Their lives resemble optimized machines, efficient, redundant, scalable. Women adopt parallel strategies, yet face structural ceilings that men sidestep. Remote work helps, but many high earning fields still reward FaceTime and networking that competes with personal life. Geographic mobility is constrained when social support networks, family, friends, remain localized. Financial tools exist, but women often carry higher baseline costs from appearance maintenance, safety considerations, and potential future child rearing expenses, even when childless. The optimization game plays out unevenly. Men reach escape velocity faster and maintain it longer because their risk profile aligns more naturally with radical autonomy. The divergence extends into cultural production itself. Content created by and for men emphasizes stoicism, discipline, competence hierarchies, and rejection of victim narratives. Podcasts, books, and videos celebrate self reliance as moral triumph. Content aimed at women increasingly blends empowerment rhetoric with therapeutic language around healing, boundaries, and systemic critique. The two streams rarely cross pollinate. Men consume material that reinforces their chosen path. Women consume material that validates struggle while promising eventual breakthrough. Shared cultural reference points erode. Memes diverge. Humor styles separate. The common language shrinks to transactional basics. This cultural bifurcation feeds back into education and child rearing patterns. Boys raised primarily by single mothers or in female dominated environments absorb different socialization than those with balanced or male led households. They learn early that male authority is provisional, that emotional expression carries risk, that institutional fairness is not guaranteed. Many gravitate toward online male spaces for guidance, adopting frameworks that prioritize self protection over openness. Girls receive amplified messaging around agency and caution, yet they also witness the practical limits of solo navigation. Both groups mature with lower expectations for lifelong partnership and higher skepticism toward romantic idealism. Dating among younger cohorts already reflects the inheritance. Casual arrangements dominate, commitment thresholds rise, cohabitation precedes marriage, if marriage occurs at all, and permanent singlehood gains legitimacy as a deliberate choice rather than default outcome. The legitimacy of permanent singlehood reshapes every downstream institution. Employers adjust benefits packages to reflect more single employees, higher individual health contributions, flexible leave policies untied to family status, wellness programs targeting solitary burnout. Retail and hospitality pivot toward experiences designed for one or small groups rather than couples and families. Urban planning debates intensify around density versus sprawl when household formation rates stagnate. Religious institutions, once anchors of family centric life, either double down on traditional teachings or adapt by creating robust single adult ministries. The adaptation is uneven. Some denominations thrive by maintaining clear expectations around pairing, while others hemorrhage younger members who see little relevance in family focused messaging. Through all these layers, the central fact remains unchanged. Men have found a configuration that delivers superior personal outcomes under current boundary conditions. They wake up without negotiation, pursue goals without compromise, accumulate without leakage, recover without drama. The configuration proves durable because it rests on internal locus of control rather than external reciprocity. Each year of success entrenches the pattern further. Regret stays minimal because the alternative path keeps delivering measurable gains. The momentum builds organically as more men reach the same conclusion through observation and experimentation. Society therefore enters uncharted territory where a critical mass of adults opts out of the reproductive and relational cycle that sustained civilization for millennia. The consequences unfold gradually, then suddenly. Shrinking tax bases, overburdened welfare states, cultural tone shifts toward individualism, innovation driven by solitary geniuses rather than collaborative teams, art that reflects isolation rather than connection. No single policy lever reverses the trend because the driver is incentive misalignment at the individual level. Only when the perceived cost benefit equation for men flips through legal equity, cultural revaluation of male contributions, or demonstration that partnership can deliver net positive returns will participation rates potentially rebound. Until then, the withdrawal continues, quiet, rational, and increasingly normalized. The era of automatic male engagement has ended. What replaces it is selective, conditional, and self referenced. Men have walked away, not out of hatred, but out of clarity. They have tested solitude and found it abundant. They have measured risk and chosen peace. They continue building lives of purpose on their own terms, undisturbed by demands they no longer accept as legitimate. The path they have chosen is proving sustainable, scalable, and most importantly, preferable to the previous arrangement. As long as that preference holds, the separation persists, the demographics contract, and society rearranges itself around a new center of gravity defined by individual sovereignty rather than mutual obligation. If you have watched all the way through this deep dive into the mechanics, incentives, consequences, and trajectory of men walking away, then you belong to the 1 hour gang. Respect for sticking with it to the end. If these angry guy breakdowns resonate with you and you want more of this unfiltered clarity, you can show support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the engine running. Drop a comment below and tell me what hit hardest in this discussion. Do you see the same patterns playing out around you? Do you agree with the direction this is heading? Share your thoughts without holding back. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing, nothing, nothing. nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.